Maggie adjusted her scarf as she checked the time on her phone, her steps steady as she walked through the airport parking lot. Her heels clicked against the pavement, the faint hum of overhead announcements blending with the distant rush of travelers hurrying to catch flights. She wasn't in a rush. She rarely was anymore. The trip was routine. Another business meeting, another hotel room with too much polished wood and too little personality. But it was a break from the same old pattern, and at 62, any change felt like a small victory. She'd packed lightly, a practical, dark leather carry-on and a sensible black coat. Her flight would be departing in about an hour, plenty of time to sit, sip coffee, and reflect. She'd been managing the business solo since David passed. The company was thriving, but there was always the undercurrent of quiet loneliness, the absence of his voice, his laughter, the echo of what had been. A silver SUV skidded to a stop in front of her, tires squealing on the slick asphalt. Maggie looked up, already knowing who it was before the tinted window rolled down. Ryan. Of course. He didn't wait for her to approach. His car door swung open without a word, and in that instant, Maggie's stomach tightened in anticipation. She'd been here before. Before she could even place her bag into the back seat, the door slammed shut with a sickening thud, right on her arm. The sharp pain shot up her elbow and she winced, biting her lip. "Sorry, I'm late, can't wait around," Ryan said, his voice distant, dismissive. He barely glanced at her, eyes already on his phone, tapping away. Maggie stood frozen for a moment. Her arm pinned between the door and the frame, a slow burn of frustration rising inside her. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, some disapproving, others unsure whether to intervene. Her first instinct was to react, to snap back, but she held herself still, swallowing the fury that bubbled in her chest. No, she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She gently extricated her arm from the door, trying not to wince as the cold air pressed against the raw skin. She straightened herself and slid into the car, careful not to let her anger spill over into a response. Ryan didn't deserve that. No more. The leather seat creaked as she settled in, adjusting the strap of her purse. She looked out the window, watching the constant flow of people. They seemed so absorbed in their own lives, rushing to their destinations, unaware of the quiet wars people fought in their personal worlds. And for a moment, she felt small, like just another person in a sea of strangers. But then it hit her. The realization, as sharp as the pain in her arm. She'd spent so many years letting Ryan's arrogance slide, letting his disregard for her go unchecked, pretending it didn't hurt, that it didn't matter. But today was different. Inside, something inside her snapped. She wasn't the same woman who had let David's death break her. She wasn't the same woman who had watched Ryan grow into the entitled, selfish man he had become. She had been quiet, careful, measured. But that was no longer enough. She'd made a decision, and this time it would be final. Ryan would learn what it meant to disrespect her, and he would regret every moment of it. "Can we just get this over with?" Ryan muttered from the driver's seat, unaware of the storm brewing beside him. Maggie didn't respond. She turned her face toward the window, watching the world move past. She would let him go on, clueless as always, thinking he was in control. But in the silence of that moment, she knew the truth. She was in control now. Ryan drove, his hands tight on the steering wheel as they approached the terminal. Maggie felt her heartbeat slow, her mind already planning the next move. She would handle this with grace, the way she always did. But she would not let this go. She would not let him keep taking her for granted. When the car stopped, Maggie opened the door, pausing for a moment before stepping out. The cold air brushed against her face and she inhaled deeply. She could hear Ryan's voice behind her. But she didn't look back. She wasn't going to waste another minute on him. As she walked toward the terminal, the sounds of the airport swirled around her. Laughter, announcements, the shuffle of hurried feet. But there was one thing she could no longer ignore: the gnawing certainty that everything was about to change. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt the weight of her decisions settle into place. The slam of that door hadn't just closed on her arm, it had slammed shut on everything Ryan thought he was entitled to. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She wasn't just a woman pushing past her pain. She was someone to be reckoned with. She smiled to herself, a faint, knowing curve of her lips, and as she disappeared into the crowd, she left Ryan behind, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Maggie entered the terminal, her heels clicking softly against the cool marble floors, each step deliberate, like a measured countdown to something inevitable. The rush of travelers around her felt almost distant, like she was watching the world through a window. Alive, moving, yet somehow separate from her. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. She found an empty seat by the window, facing the runway. The airport's hum surrounded her. Voices raised in conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, the soft announcement of departing flights echoing in the overhead speakers. But inside, it was quiet. Her mind was razor-focused, cutting through the noise, cutting through everything that had led up to this moment. The slam of the door on her arm, Ryan's careless words, the years of quiet dismissal. She placed her bag carefully beside her, not bothering to remove the scarf from around her neck. She felt it, a deep, burning stillness. She didn't even want the coffee she'd planned to order. The feeling inside her was enough to fuel her for hours. With a slow, practiced motion, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. The screen blinked to life, and her thumb hovered over the keyboard as she scrolled through the messages, her gaze settling on Ryan's latest. "Hope the trip's worth it. You're always traveling anyway." Her fingers twitched with the impulse to respond, to lash out, to send something sharp and biting in return. But that wasn't what she needed. That wasn't the move. She had learned long ago that power wasn't in reacting. It was in controlling the narrative. And right now, the narrative had to be hers. She stared at the screen for a long moment, a storm of thoughts swirling behind her calm exterior. Every word she'd said to Ryan, every silent argument she'd held in her head over the years, every moment of doubt, it all crystallized in her mind. The decision she'd made in the car, the sharp clarity that had settled into her bones, was not a momentary whim. It was the result of years of disrespect, of her being pushed aside, of being unseen. She had let it go for too long, but no more. Her thumb pressed down, the letters forming with purposeful precision. "I'm changing my will." She paused, the words hanging in the air for a heartbeat longer than she'd intended. It was a simple statement, yet it carried all the weight of her resolve. It wasn't about the money anymore, not entirely. It was about something deeper, something Ryan had never understood: respect. She added a second line: "Let's discuss when I return." There was no need to elaborate further. She didn't need to explain. She wasn't asking for permission. She was informing him of a fact. Maggie read over the text one last time, her fingers hovering over the send button. Her gaze lifted to the window, where the planes sat in neat rows, their engines humming with the promise of departure, of escape. This moment, this text, was the beginning of something new, something that couldn't be undone. With a steady hand, she hit send. The message was gone. And with it, a part of her that had held back for far too long. She leaned back in her seat, her body relaxed but alert, as if she were preparing for a long battle, and this was just the first skirmish. Ryan would get the message eventually, but she didn't expect a response. Not immediately. Not yet. It didn't matter. She'd said what needed to be said. And in the silence of the airport, surrounded by strangers too absorbed in their own lives to notice her, she felt something that had eluded her for years. Peace. It wasn't the peace of being forgiven or of making amends. It was the peace of knowing that she was finally in control. Her flight was called over the intercom, the smooth, impersonal voice cutting through the air like a signal, a reminder that time was moving, that things were changing. Maggie stood, smoothing her coat over her shoulders, and took one last glance at the phone in her hand. There were no immediate replies, no desperate texts or calls from Ryan demanding answers. She didn't need them. She wasn't interested in what Ryan thought. Not anymore. With one final glance at the terminal, Maggie turned and walked toward the gate, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the floor, steady and purposeful. There was no looking back. She was done with being unseen. And from this moment forward, she was the one who would decide when the doors would open or slam shut. As she disappeared into the crowd, there was one thing she knew for certain. Ryan had no idea what was coming. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the tall windows of Maggie's office. The golden light caught the edges of her sleek modern desk, scattering across the polished wood, a fleeting warmth that felt strangely foreign to her. She was no stranger to cold, to control, but today, the warmth felt like something she had to push against. Victor sat across from her, his posture composed, but his eyes, those sharp, attentive eyes, were watching her closely. He'd been her lawyer, her confidant for decades. His loyalty was unquestioned, and in this moment he was the one person who truly understood the quiet war Maggie had been fighting for years, a war against Ryan's entitled arrogance, his unearned expectations, his total disregard for everything she had worked for. The will was open on the desk between them, the legal language sprawling across the pages, neat and precise. Victor's finger traced the lines, his eyes scanning the familiar text. Maggie's gaze lingered on the document too, but her thoughts were far from the legalese. She thought of Ryan, his smirking face, the way he spoke to her like she was a relic, a shadow of a woman who no longer had the strength to make decisions. His careless comments had been piling up for years, each one a small insult she had quietly absorbed, each one a drop in the bucket. Her fingers drummed lightly on the surface of the desk. "Do you think this will be enough?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. Victor, ever the professional, took a beat before answering. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes briefly flicking to the will and then back to Maggie. "Perhaps," he said, "but he's never respected you. Will he respect this?" She looked down at the document in front of her. There was Ryan's portion, carefully crafted, enough to ensure he couldn't claim neglect, enough to keep him comfortable, or so she thought. But now, in the silence of this room, Maggie knew the truth. Ryan had never earned it. He had never earned the wealth she'd built, the legacy she had fought tooth and nail for. He'd taken it all for granted, and for far too long, she had let him. Maggie smiled softly, a thin line curling at the edges of her lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth or affection. It was something colder, something more calculating. "Not if I can help it," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Victor didn't reply immediately. He was too sharp to miss the subtle shift in her tone, too attuned to the dangerous undercurrents running beneath her calm exterior. Maggie wasn't the kind of woman who made threats. She made decisions, and those decisions had consequences. With a quiet motion, Maggie pushed the will aside and reached into a drawer in her desk, pulling out a separate file. She opened it, revealing a new set of documents, thicker, more detailed. These were the real plans, the ones she had been quietly formulating. She didn't need to explain them to Victor. He would understand. "I'm making changes," she said softly, her fingers skimming the pages. "Ryan won't be a part of the future anymore. I'm setting up the trust, shifting the assets. It's time he learned the true value of respect. Victor leaned forward slightly, his gaze flicking over the new documents, his brow furrowing as he read. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice gentle, almost cautious. "This is permanent. It's not something we can undo easily." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Maggie replied, her tone hardening. "He's never respected me, Victor. And if he doesn't respect the woman who built this empire, then he doesn't deserve it. Not a single penny." Victor didn't argue. He knew better. He'd seen Maggie's resolve before, knew that when she made a decision, there was no turning back. He glanced down at the document once more, and then back up at her, his expression unreadable. "And Lucas?" Maggie's gaze softened as she looked at the picture of Lucas she kept on her desk. A younger, quieter version of Ryan. He wasn't like his father. He wasn't driven by the same sense of entitlement, the same hunger for power. "Lucas," Maggie said quietly, "will be the one who understands. He's always had respect for me. He's the one who's been paying attention even when Ryan hasn't." Victor nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling into the room like a heavy fog. There was no denying it. Ryan had failed to see what mattered. He had failed to see the power of respect, the quiet strength Maggie had held all these years. Maggie adjusted her glasses, her gaze shifting from Victor to the open files in front of her. She wasn't just adjusting the will, not just shifting numbers and names. She was shifting the future, shaping it with her own hands in a way Ryan would never expect, never see coming. Her finger traced the lines on the page, sealing her decision. "When I get back," she said, her voice steady, "I want everything finalized. Everything." Victor stood, his chair scraping lightly against the floor, and placed a reassuring hand on the file. "You'll have it," he said, his voice firm. "You know I'll take care of everything." As Victor left the room, Maggie sat there for a moment, alone in the quiet. The sun had set by now and the room had grown dim, but the darkness didn't bother her. It was just another layer of control, another quiet reminder that she was the one who held the power. She wasn't just the mother. She wasn't just the businesswoman. She was the one who decided who would inherit the future. And Ryan, with his arrogance, would never see it coming. The plane's wheels had barely touched the tarmac when Maggie's thoughts snapped back into focus. The flight had been uneventful. Too much white noise. Too many thoughts swirling in her mind. She'd spent the entire journey carefully controlling her emotions, pushing aside the gnawing weight of the decision she had made, knowing it would all come to a head when she reached her destination. Now, the long stretches of sky outside the window had been replaced by the sprawl of the city below, her temporary escape gone. She waited for the other passengers to exit before she moved, taking her time to stand up and collect her things. The soft hum of overhead lights and the shuffle of rolling suitcases were just background noise as her mind shifted back to her purpose. San Francisco. The city that had watched her build her empire, her quiet fortress. It was the city that had witnessed the beginning of her power, and now it would witness the final step of her reclamation. She wasn't here for anything routine. This wasn't another business trip. This was a reckoning. As she made her way through the terminal, she could already feel the subtle tension building, the weight of what was about to unfold. She had to make the call. The one that would make it all official. The one that would lock Ryan out and seal his fate. Maggie found a quiet corner near the gates, the air conditioning humming gently overhead, the echoes of passengers hurrying to their next destinations fading into the background. She pulled her phone from her purse, fingers moving swiftly as she unlocked the screen and found Victor's number. The weight of the moment settled into her chest as she hit the call button. The phone rang twice before Victor's voice answered, calm and steady, as always. "Maggie?" "I've landed," she said, her voice clipped. But there was an underlying calm that hadn't been there a few months ago. She could hear Victor's subtle intake of breath on the other end, that professional edge to his tone. He was already preparing for what was coming. "Good," he said. "Is everything set?" Maggie didn't hesitate. She had thought about this moment 1,000 times. It was time to finish what she had started. "I want everything finalized by next week," she said, her voice firm. The finality of the words settled over her like a shroud, and there was no second-guessing them. Victor was quiet for a moment, and Maggie could almost hear him processing the gravity of her request. "Are you sure you want to do this? It'll be permanent," he asked, the concern in his voice faint but unmistakable. "He doesn't deserve another cent," Maggie replied, her voice unwavering. There was no hesitation now, no room for doubt. The decision had been made. Ryan had shown her exactly who he was, and it wasn't someone she was willing to support any longer. Not after everything he'd done, the way he'd treated her. He had forfeited his right to any of it. "Understood," Victor said after a beat, his voice as steady as ever. "I'll move everything into the trust. Lucas will be the sole beneficiary, as we discussed. Ryan will be locked out completely. No access to anything, now or in the future." Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the terminal around her. She could feel the weight of the decision, the gravity of what she was doing. But there was no room for regret. No space left for second-guessing. She had been more than patient, more than understanding. Ryan's behavior had gone unchecked for far too long, and now the time had come to take control. "You'll have everything finalized by next week?" she asked, her voice sharp with authority. "Absolutely," Victor replied. "I'll make sure all the paperwork is in place, and the assets are secured in the trust. There's no going back from here. Everything will be locked down." Maggie's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. It was exactly what she needed to hear. She wasn't sure if it was the satisfaction of seeing her plan unfold, or the relief that came with the certainty of the next steps, but it felt right. Everything was falling into place. The announcement for her next flight crackled over the intercom, and Maggie glanced at her watch. Time was moving quickly, but there was no rush. She had already made the most important decision. Now, she would wait for the world to catch up. "I'll be ready," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "You'll be in control," Victor replied, his voice tinged with an unspoken respect for the quiet power Maggie wielded. It wasn't just legal maneuvering. It wasn't just about money. It was about showing Ryan what it meant to cross a line, to underestimate her. Maggie hung up the phone, her eyes still fixed on the crowd moving through the terminal. She knew Ryan would be angry, he would be confused. But what he didn't understand, what he would never understand, is that she wasn't punishing him out of malice. She was doing it because she loved him. In her own way, it was the only way she could show him the consequences of his arrogance. She stood up and glanced at the departure gate, where a group of passengers was waiting to board their flight. Her mind drifted for a moment. She was just one person among many, but now, for the first time in a long time, she felt truly free. Her future was in her hands, and Ryan would never see it coming. The office was silent except for the soft scratch of Maggie's pen against the paper. She sat alone at the large mahogany desk, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. The documents in front of her were simple in appearance, but their significance was anything but. The text was clear, concise. The language had been carefully chosen, its intent unmistakable. It was final. The papers had been meticulously prepared by Victor's office, with every clause, every sentence, crafted to ensure the trust would be irreversible. Maggie's fingers hovered for a moment over the last signature line. She had waited for this moment for months, perhaps longer. She was doing what she knew had to be done, but it didn't make the act any less powerful. There was something profound about signing these papers, something almost ceremonial, as though it marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. It wasn't just the transfer of assets that mattered. It wasn't just the shifting of wealth. This was control. This was power. Her pen glided across the page, leaving a firm signature beneath the lines of the irrevocable trust. The ink was dark, decisive. Her name was a stamp of authority, confirming that Ryan's claim to the family fortune was over. It had always been hers to give, but now there would be no going back. Lucas's name, bold and secure, stood as the sole heir. He would inherit everything when he turned 30, with full control of the empire she had built, a different kind of control than Ryan ever imagined. A control earned through respect, through understanding. Lucas had been the one who listened, the one who had observed with quiet patience, even when his father had made him feel invisible. Maggie set the pen down and leaned back in her chair, looking over the trust documents one last time. She could feel the weight of the decision, but there was no regret, no second thoughts. Only the knowledge that Ryan had forfeited everything with his behavior. He had done this to himself. She stood up, collecting the signed papers and placing them in a large envelope. She sealed it with a quiet snap, then slid it into a file that had been carefully prepared for delivery to Victor. She would ensure it was filed immediately. It would take time for the official notifications to be sent, for Ryan to receive the legal documents, but in the quiet of her office, Maggie could almost hear the ticking of the clock. Each second that passed, drawing her closer to the inevitable confrontation. She exhaled slowly, a sense of calm settling in her chest. This was not an act of malice, but of necessary justice. Ryan had built his own future, one that excluded her, one where her authority, her quiet strength, had been nothing but an inconvenience. But now, Maggie had taken back what was hers, and she would watch as the world unfolded around him, watching him flounder as the foundation he thought he stood on crumbled beneath him. The phone on her desk buzzed, cutting through the silence. She glanced down and saw Ryan's name flashing on the screen, his latest text appearing in bold letters. "I'll be at your house next weekend. We need to talk about the will." Maggie smiled softly, the curve of her lips faint but knowing. She'd expected this. Of course, he would demand a conversation. Of course, he would try to salvage what he thought was still within his grasp. But he didn't realize. He didn't understand that the moment he had slammed that door on her, the moment he had treated her like she didn't matter, everything had already been decided. She typed a response, taking her time, her fingers moving slowly over the keys. "We'll talk when I get back. But you should know, Ryan, it's too late to change anything now." She pressed send, then set the phone back down on the desk, her hands lingering for a moment on the cool surface. She thought of how Ryan would react when he received the official papers, how he would rage, how he would protest. It wouldn't matter. She had already decided, and there was nothing left for him to do but accept it. Maggie glanced at the sealed envelope once more before heading toward the door. The weight of the decision still hung in the air, but it was a weight she was more than willing to carry. It was the price of respect. It was the price of finally being seen. She stepped into the hallway, her heels clicking on the marble floor with every step. The rest of the world continued around her, but Maggie knew that the storm she had set in motion was only beginning. The inevitable confrontation with Ryan was coming, and she was ready. She had taken control. And soon, Ryan would learn exactly what that meant. The morning light filtered through the office windows, casting soft shadows across the floor as Maggie sat at her desk, sipping her coffee. Her hands were steady, her mind focused, the calm before the storm. She had expected the backlash from Ryan, but she wasn't sure exactly how it would unfold. It was a waiting game now, a test of patience, control, and resolve. Her phone buzzed on the desk and she glanced down, seeing the familiar name flashing on the screen. Ryan. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to hear his voice just yet. Instead, she opened her laptop, pulling up her email, ready for whatever he would send. The message from Ryan appeared near the top of her inbox, its subject line straightforward and forceful. "We need to talk about the will." Maggie didn't hesitate. She clicked on it, leaning back in her chair as her fingers grazed the keys of the keyboard. She wasn't surprised by the tone, but it did make her smile, a faint, knowing curve of her lips. She'd been anticipating this moment. His anger, his sense of entitlement. It was all part of the script. The email was brief, yet cutting. Ryan's words were sharp, his sense of injustice bleeding through every sentence. "Mom, we need to talk. I don't know what you think you're doing, but cutting me out of the inheritance is unreasonable. You've always said I would take over the business someday. And now you're alienating the family with this sudden decision. You know how important this is to me. This isn't how things should be. I expect you to reconsider. We need to meet and discuss this as soon as possible." The message ended with a demand to meet next weekend, to talk things through, and come to a resolution. Maggie read the email through once, then again, and each time it felt more like a script she had read 1,000 times before. Ryan's desperation was evident, but so was his ignorance. He still didn't get it. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting lightly on the desk, contemplating the email's contents. Unreasonable, alienating the family. The words were carefully chosen, meant to manipulate her, to make her doubt herself. But Maggie wasn't a woman who doubted. Not anymore. She couldn't help the small, knowing smile that tugged at her lips as she thought about the scene that was about to unfold. Ryan had already made the mistake of thinking this was all just a misunderstanding. He had no idea the depth of her resolve, the quiet power she had spent decades building. He was a man used to getting his way, used to having everything handed to him. But now, the tables had turned, and Maggie had a front row seat to watch it all unravel. She clicked the reply button and opened a new message. With calm deliberation, she typed a single line. "I've received your email. I'm not reconsidering. I'll have my lawyer contact you. Don't bother coming next weekend. There's nothing to discuss." She hit send without a second thought. Her decision had already been made, and she wasn't about to be swayed by Ryan's manipulation. The email would get a reaction, and she was ready for it. After sending the email, Maggie picked up her phone and dialed Victor's number. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice low and steady on the other end. "Victor," she began, her voice cool, controlled. "I've just received Ryan's email. I'm forwarding it to you. Prepare for a response." She clicked forward, attaching the message, and with a single line added, "Let's make sure he knows there's no turning back now." Victor's response was immediate, as expected. "I'll handle it, Maggie. Hold steady. You're in control now." His words, simple and direct, grounded her. He knew this wasn't just a legal battle. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about power, respect, and making Ryan see the truth. She had always been in control, but now it was more apparent than ever. Maggie exhaled slowly, steeling herself. The calm had settled, but underneath, a current of excitement simmered. She wasn't nervous. No, it was the thrill of watching the plan unfold, knowing it was all coming to a head. Ryan's email was just the beginning. The confrontation was inevitable, and now that he'd made his move, Maggie was ready to make hers. She wasn't just defending her decision anymore. She was preparing for the fallout, for the emotional storm that Ryan would bring with him when he realized there was no more room for negotiation. She stood up from the desk and glanced out the window, watching the world outside move at a hurried pace, unaware of the tension that had just ignited. The clock was ticking, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Ryan arrived in San Francisco, demanding answers. But Maggie was already steps ahead. She had made her move, and there was no going back. With a deep breath, she walked toward the door. The storm was coming, and she was ready to face it head-on. Ryan had no idea what was waiting for him. And this time, it wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about respect. It was about power. Maggie sat at her desk, the soft hum of the city beyond the glass window almost drowned out by the quiet buzz of her thoughts. She had expected this. Ryan's fury was a given, his self-righteousness always flaring when things didn't go his way. She had signed the trust documents. Everything was in place. Lucas was set to inherit, and Ryan had been locked out. It was done. The steady rhythm of her pen against the paper was interrupted by the ping of an incoming email. She glanced at the screen, Ryan's name flashing in the subject line. "We need to talk about the will." She clicked open the message, settling back in her chair, fingers clasped together. His words were exactly as expected. Urgent, demanding, full of indignation. "Mom, we need to talk. I don't know what you think you're doing, but cutting me out of the inheritance is unreasonable. You've always said I would take over the business someday, and now you're alienating the family with this sudden decision. You know how important this is to me. This isn't how things should be. I expect you to reconsider. We need to meet and discuss this as soon as possible." Maggie's lips twitched slightly in an almost imperceptible smile. The words weren't new. She had heard them in countless forms over the years, entitlement masked as concern. A demand for reconciliation, but only on his terms. It was predictable. It was Ryan. She read the email a second time, each word feeling like an echo of all the times he had underestimated her. He thought this was about the money, but it wasn't. It never had been. For Ryan, it was always about power, control, and his own inflated sense of importance. Maggie's hand moved to her keyboard, and with deliberate care, she typed out her response. "I've received your email. I'm not reconsidering. I'll have my lawyer contact you. Don't bother coming next weekend. There's nothing to discuss." She hit send without a second thought. It was simple, direct. There would be no room for negotiation, no more second chances. Ryan had sealed his own fate when he slammed that door on her at the airport, and now she was closing the door for good. As she sat back in her chair, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Victor. She opened it immediately. "I saw Ryan's email. Prepare yourself. He'll escalate, but we both know he has no leverage." Maggie read the message, feeling a calm surge of satisfaction. Victor was right. Ryan could escalate all he wanted, but it wouldn't change the facts. She had already made her decision. Everything was in motion. Maggie quickly forwarded Ryan's email to Victor with a simple note. "Prepare for a response." She didn't need to say more. Victor knew what to do. He would handle the legal side. She would handle the emotional fallout. Ryan would try to twist this into a story of betrayal. But the truth was simple. Ryan had never earned what he believed was his. Her phone buzzed again, but it wasn't from Victor this time. It was another text from Ryan. "You can't just do this to me. I'm your son. We need to talk. You won't get away with this. I'll be at your house next weekend." Maggie's lips curled into a tight smile. "I'll be at your house next weekend," he said. Like it was that simple. But he didn't understand. He never had. She typed a response, her fingers moving deliberately over the keys. "We'll talk when I get back. But you should know, Ryan, it's too late to change anything now." She set the phone down on her desk and leaned back in her chair, a moment of quiet reflection. The storm was coming, but Maggie wasn't worried. She was prepared. She'd spent years laying the groundwork for this moment. Ryan could rage, he could demand meetings, but it didn't matter. He had crossed a line, and now there would be consequences. Victor's response came a few moments later. "Hold steady, you're in control now." Maggie read his words, the weight of them settling in her chest. Control. She had always been in control. But now, it was clearer than ever. She stood, walked over to the window, and looked out at the city below. The cars moved in a constant stream, people rushing through their day, unaware of the storm brewing in her life. Maggie knew something they didn't, that she was the one calling the shots now. She turned away from the window and gathered her things, her heart steady, her mind focused. Ryan would come next weekend, of course. He'd try to make her feel guilty, try to talk his way back in. But it was too late. The future was already decided. Maggie felt the weight of it, the certainty of it, settle over her like a cloak. She was ready. And when Ryan finally realized there was nothing he could do, it would be too late for him to fix the damage. The door would stay closed. The dinner table was set meticulously, as always, soft candlelight flickering in the center. The delicate silverware arranged with precision, the fine china gleaming under the warm glow of the chandelier. A spread of simple but elegant dishes, the kind Maggie had always favored, was laid out in front of her. The clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of the ambient conversation made the evening feel like any other. But Maggie knew better. There was nothing ordinary about tonight. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her chest, the calm before the storm. Ryan and Megan settled into their seats, neither of them looking in Maggie's direction just yet. They were already deep in conversation about some real estate deal Ryan had his eye on, a new property, a new acquisition. It didn't matter, Maggie thought. They were both the same, obsessed with their ambitions, their futures, their plans. Their world was built on their own terms, their own expectations. And in that world, Maggie was just a footnote. A person to be placated when necessary, but always someone to be overlooked. "Have you heard about the new property on Pine Street?" Ryan asked, his voice loud and brash, as if announcing an achievement. "I think it's the perfect investment. The numbers are great. It'll secure everything for us." Maggie let her gaze drift over to him, watching the way his mouth moved, the familiar arrogance that danced behind his eyes. He hadn't changed. He still didn't understand what had happened, what was happening right under his nose. He still thought the world would bend to his will, that his father's legacy, and her wealth, was his by right. Megan leaned in, nodding politely, eyes sharp with something that Maggie couldn't quite place. But it didn't matter. Megan was always playing her part, always pretending to be supportive, always pretending to be on Maggie's side while quietly plotting in the shadows. It was a game she played well, but Maggie had stopped playing that game long ago. Maggie smiled softly, the kind of smile that masked everything. She had to. They would never expect it. They had no idea what was coming. As the conversation continued, they talked about moving forward, a phrase they threw around often. It was their way of avoiding the truth. Moving forward meant pretending things were the same. Moving forward meant pretending Maggie was still the same passive observer she had been for years. They didn't know, didn't even see, the quiet revolution Maggie had been orchestrating. She took a sip of wine, letting the silence stretch just long enough for them to settle into their comfort zone. Then, as if nothing had changed, she placed her glass down gently on the table. "I'm glad we're talking about moving forward," she said, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the noise of their chatter. They both turned toward her in unison, Ryan with his half-smile, Megan with her practiced politeness. Maggie looked from one to the other, her gaze steady. There was no need to rush. She wanted them to feel that moment of unease, the subtle tension in the air that came just before everything changed. It was a power she had learned to wield. This silence, this control. And then, with quiet certainty, she dropped the bomb. "The will has been updated," she said, her voice smooth and unwavering. Ryan's smile faltered. The hand that had been reaching for his glass stilled in midair. His eyes narrowed, disbelief flickering across his face. Megan's face remained perfectly composed, but Maggie could see the way her jaw tightened ever so slightly. She was calculating, trying to understand the meaning behind Maggie's words, trying to decide how to play this. Ryan finally spoke, his voice tinged with confusion. "What do you mean? We haven't discussed it." He leaned forward, his hand slapping the table slightly, as if trying to shake some sense into the situation. "This isn't how it's supposed to go, Mom. We were going to talk about it. Figure this out." Maggie didn't flinch. She just looked at him, her eyes steady, unwavering. She wasn't surprised. She had expected this. The confusion, the outrage, the complete lack of comprehension that she would dare change the game. "I made the decision," she said quietly, her words slow, deliberate. "You are no longer part of it." Ryan blinked, the shock on his face so raw, so genuine, it almost made Maggie want to laugh. He couldn't process it. He had never imagined that this moment would come, that he would be the one left out, not the one in control. You can't do this," he stammered, his voice rising, the first cracks of panic slipping through the cracks of his arrogance. "You're my mother. I'm your son." Maggie leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. The years of tolerating his entitled behavior, the years of keeping silent, the years of playing the role of the dutiful mother. Those days were gone. She wasn't just his mother anymore. She was the one who controlled the future. She was the one who decided who would inherit the empire. "You're not part of it anymore, Ryan," Maggie said softly, almost kindly. "You've never earned it. And now, it's too late." The words landed with a finality that hit harder than any argument, any protest, any demand for reconciliation. Maggie felt the room freeze, felt the shock spread across their faces like wildfire. Ryan's anger would build, of course. It always did. But it didn't matter. He had no control anymore. For the first time in years, Maggie felt the weight of the situation shift in her favor. And Ryan, for all his bluster, was finally learning what it meant to be truly powerless. The silence in the room hung heavy, thicker than the expensive wine in their glasses. Ryan's face had gone from disbelief to something darker. Anger. Confusion. The faintest traces of fear. Maggie could see the wheels turning in his head, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Megan, on the other hand, sat perfectly still, her eyes scanning the table, her fingers clutching the wine glass like a lifeline. She hadn't expected this either. None of them had. Ryan was the first to break the silence. His voice was sharp, clipped, and rising. "Why? Why would you do this? You can't just change everything like that without even discussing it with me." His words were spat with such force that Maggie could feel the heat of his frustration reaching across the table. Maggie didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She had known this moment would come. The confrontation, the desperation in his voice. It was all part of the script. He had always been so certain of his place in her life. In her world. He never imagined a world where that place could be revoked. But tonight, the script had flipped, and Maggie had written it. Ryan stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a sharp scrape that echoed in the stillness. His hands gripped the edge of the table as if trying to steady himself, but Maggie saw the trembling in his fingers. "This isn't fair. I'm your son. I've worked hard for this family, for the business. I deserve this. This is my birthright." Maggie let the words hang in the air for a moment, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. She was beyond that. She'd made her decision, and she was simply waiting for him to understand it. Megan, sensing the growing tension, finally spoke up. Her voice was soft but insistent. The tone one Maggie had heard countless times in meetings and social gatherings, polished, controlled, But underneath it, there was always an agenda. Maggie, this is a misunderstanding, right? We'll fix this, she said, her eyes locking with Maggie's in an unspoken plea for reason. Maggie leaned back in her chair, the silence thickening with each passing second. She let them talk themselves into a corner, Ryan's protests growing louder, Megan's tone more conciliatory. Both of them, clutching at straws, trying to pull the rug back under them, trying to negotiate their way out of the situation. But Maggie was done negotiating. "You both treated me like an inconvenience," she said calmly, her voice low and steady, cutting through their noise. Ryan's eyes snapped to her, his anger simmering, but Maggie remained unmoved. She had seen this before. His tantrums, his misplaced sense of entitlement. "You took me for granted. You thought I would always be there, always giving, always supporting, always doing things your way. But I'm fixing that now." Ryan's face turned a shade paler, but his mouth was still moving, shouting words he thought might change the situation. But Maggie wasn't listening to him anymore. She wasn't going to explain herself. She didn't need to. She could feel Lucas standing at the edge of the room, watching, waiting. He had been quiet since the start of dinner, not taking part in the heated conversation that had been escalating. Maggie caught his eye and saw the silent understanding there. He had known what was coming, had seen it for what it was. As Ryan continued his outburst, demanding legal explanations, more answers, more reasons, Maggie smiled. A small, knowing smile, one that came from a place deep inside her, where the weight of her decisions had already settled into place. "You'll have your day in court, Ryan," she said, her voice smooth, the words almost a whisper. "But not now. Not here." Megan's face was tight with frustration, but Ryan's was something else. Completely undone. He couldn't comprehend the finality of it. Maggie could see the storm building in his eyes. He was gearing up for another round of protests, but she wasn't going to let him waste any more of her time. Before Ryan could speak again, Lucas stepped forward, his presence quiet but powerful in the tense room. He didn't look at his father, but his gaze was steady as he walked to Maggie's side. Without a word, he stood beside her, and then, with quiet resolve, he nodded toward her. "I'm proud of you, Grandma," he said softly, his voice clear in the stillness of the room. Maggie's heart swelled with a quiet pride, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. She had made the right decision. She had done what needed to be done. And Ryan, with all his shouting, with all his bluster, finally understood what it meant to lose everything. Maggie turned her gaze back to Ryan, watching the last of his anger dissolve into disbelief. His shoulders slumped slightly as the weight of reality began to settle in. This was it. The game was over. And Maggie had won. The courtroom was a quiet sea of polished wood and gleaming metal. The low murmur of voices, lawyers shuffling papers, clients exchanging tense glances, bounced off the high ceilings, their words lost in the cavernous space. Maggie stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. This wasn't unfamiliar to her. She'd spent enough time in similar rooms, but today, the stakes were different. Today, it wasn't about negotiation or compromise, it was about finality. She took a breath, steadying herself, and walked toward the front of the room. Her steps were purposeful, each one measured, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She didn't look back, didn't glance at the gallery of observers or the photographers who always seemed to find their way into these kinds of cases. No, Maggie's focus was singular. The battle had been fought and won long before the courtroom doors opened, but she wasn't about to let anyone forget that she was the one in control. Ryan and Megan were already seated, looking disheveled and off-center in their usual arrogance, but something about their posture, strained, distracted, betrayed their confusion and shock. Their hair was slightly rumpled, their clothes perhaps not as crisp as they usually were. Ryan had his elbows on the table, one hand running through his hair in frustration. Megan was staring at her lap, her fingers tightly gripping a notepad that was too neatly placed to be anything but a lifeline she clung to for control. Maggie didn't look at them as she walked past, heading straight for her seat. Her lawyer, Victor, was already standing beside her, his presence calm and reassuring, a steadying force. The two exchanged a small nod, a shared understanding that today would bring a final resolution. The judge entered, a tall, imposing figure in dark robes, the courtroom falling into immediate silence. The judge's eyes swept the room before he sat down. The gavel coming down with a sharp crack. "This hearing will now begin," he said, his voice deep, authoritative. Maggie could feel the weight of the moment settle over her, but her expression remained neutral. She was in control. This was no longer about emotions or family. This was about law, and she knew the law was on her side. Ryan, on the other hand, was already stirring, his face red with the heat of frustration. He leaned forward, looking directly at the judge, demanding to be heard. "Your Honor, I don't understand how this is possible," he said, his voice rising in a mix of anger and disbelief. "The will has been changed without my knowledge. I'm entitled to everything here. I'm her son. The law—" Maggie's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Ryan was still caught in his own trap, his entitlement and anger pushing him to speak before he thought. He was spinning his wheels, trying to find a way back into a situation where there was no way in. The judge raised his hand, cutting Ryan off with practiced ease. "Mr. Larkin, I've reviewed the documents. The changes to the will are legal and final. You have no legal grounds to demand a reversal." His eyes flicked to Maggie briefly before focusing back on Ryan. "You may continue, but I would advise you to focus on the facts." Ryan's face darkened, but he pressed on, undeterred. "This isn't right," he insisted, his voice tightening with each word. "This isn't what my mother would have wanted. I demand that you overrule this will." Maggie remained calm, her gaze unwavering as she watched Ryan, the fire in his eyes burning bright. There was a slight tremor in his voice, but he still couldn't grasp the full weight of his situation. He still thought he had a chance to change the outcome. He still thought he could force the issue. But he didn't understand that it was too late for that. Victor stood, placing a hand on the back of Maggie's chair as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter. The changes to the will were made following all legal protocols. There are no loopholes, no ambiguity. My client, Ms. Larkin, has every right to update her will as she sees fit. Mr. Larkin's claims are not based on any legal grounds." Maggie glanced briefly at Ryan, watching his confusion shift into the beginnings of panic. He didn't know how to argue against this. He didn't know how to deal with someone who wasn't bending to his will. The judge considered the words, flipping through the papers on his desk, his brow furrowing as he read the legal documentation. After a long pause, he nodded slowly, his voice calm but firm. "The will is clear, the trust is irrevocable, and the legal steps have been properly followed. I see no grounds for a reversal. I rule in favor of Ms. Larkin." Ryan's mouth went dry, the words hanging in the air like a weight he couldn't lift. Maggie watched his face fall, the realization finally sinking in. There was no turning back. The judge had made his ruling, and it was final. He had no claim to her wealth, her legacy. Not anymore. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet murmur as the gavel came down again, the judge declaring the case closed. Maggie felt the finality of it settle in. It was over. Victor leaned in, his voice low. "It's done, Maggie. It's over." She nodded, the weight of the decision still heavy in her chest, but now there was only peace. Ryan had fought, he'd raged, he'd demanded answers, but in the end, the law was clear. It was her legacy, her empire, and she would be the one to decide who got to share in it. As the courtroom cleared, Maggie stood, her posture straight and proud. She had been underestimated for too long, but now the tables had turned. She had made her decision, and she had won. Ryan, standing frozen at his table, was learning the hard way what it meant to cross her. The fallout from the court ruling was swift. The legal machinery had already been set in motion, and it moved with cold precision, as it always did. Maggie had known this would happen, knew it would be a shock to Ryan, a blow that would leave him reeling, but the truth was undeniable. The will had been altered, irrevocably. Ryan had no claim to the empire. Less than a day after the judge's ruling, Maggie received a call from her lawyer, Victor. The news was delivered without fanfare, just facts, clean and sharp. Ryan's assets were frozen. All of his holdings, the properties he had assumed were his, were now locked behind legal barriers. His name was removed from all future financial discussions, and the inheritance, everything Maggie had spent her life building, was no longer his to claim. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her fingers clasped together as she processed the news. She wasn't surprised, not really. But there was a sense of finality to it that still sent a small ripple of satisfaction through her. It was over. The war had been fought, the battle won, and now it was time for the consequences to unfold. Meanwhile, Ryan's responses, or lack thereof, spoke volumes. He had sent a few scattered messages in the days following the ruling, all of them laced with anger, confusion, and frustration. But there was no fight left in him. Not really. He was too busy trying to salvage his image, to manage his mounting panic, to mount any kind of meaningful resistance. Megan, as expected, was the first to go silent. Maggie hadn't expected anything different. Megan had always been the kind of person who played both sides, who maneuvered in the shadows. She had hoped, perhaps, that Maggie's victory would come with a concession, some show of grace. But the moment things began to unravel, Megan was gone, fading into the background, avoiding Maggie's calls, and, as always, trying to maintain an appearance of control. Maggie had called her once, just to test the waters. Her phone rang through twice, then went straight to voicemail. A simple, "Sorry, I'm not available," message. There was no apology, no remorse, just the need to save face. Maggie didn't bother leaving a message. She already knew. It was the silence that told the real story. From the corner of the room, Lucas watched everything unfold. He'd been quiet since the court ruling, watching the pieces fall into place. And now, as the days passed and the full weight of the fallout began to hit, he was no longer a silent observer. He had seen his father's arrogance, had seen the way he took everything for granted, but it wasn't until now that he understood the full scope of his grandmother's strength. Lucas had always respected Maggie, admired her quiet authority. But now, seeing the way she had taken back control, seeing the look in Ryan's eyes when he'd realized there was no way back, Lucas finally understood what it meant to be in control. It wasn't about shouting the loudest, or pushing others down to get ahead. It was about being steady, about knowing your worth and never compromising it. One afternoon, as Maggie sat at her desk reviewing the final legal documents, Lucas knocked on the doorframe of her office. She looked up and smiled, her eyes softening as he stepped inside. "Grandma," he said, his voice steady but with a certain reverence that made Maggie's heart swell. "I'm proud of you." Her smile widened at the simple words, the sincerity in his voice ringing true. She'd never asked for a thank you, never needed it, but hearing those words from him, the one person who truly understood the magnitude of what she'd done, meant more than any apology she could have received from Ryan. Maggie leaned back in her chair, looking at the papers before her. They were final. There was nothing left to do but wait for the dust to settle, for the legal notifications to go out. Ryan had been given the option to appeal, of course. She knew he would. It was his last grasp at control, but she also knew, in her heart, that he wouldn't. He was defeated. He'd learned the hard way that respect couldn't be demanded, only earned. She hadn't needed to explain it to him. Not anymore. Maggie stood and walked toward Lucas, her hand lightly resting on his shoulder. "Thank you, Lucas," she said quietly. "I've done what needed to be done. But I don't need an apology. I just needed respect." Lucas met her gaze. His eyes steady and strong. He understood. He had always understood. And for the first time in years, Maggie didn't feel alone in this world of expectations and manipulations. As she turned back to her desk, the weight of the papers in front of her felt lighter. She had won. Not because of the wealth, not because of the assets, but because she had taken control. She had earned the respect she had long been denied, and now, the legacy she had built, brick by brick, year after year, would be preserved in a way that no one could take from her again. And for Ryan, the storm would continue to rage. But Maggie was no longer part of the chaos. She had already won the war. The weeks following the court ruling passed in an almost surreal quiet. Maggie watched from her office window, the soft hum of her life going on around her, as the world outside seemed to continue as though nothing had changed. But for Ryan and Megan, everything was different now. Their empire, built on entitlement and ambition, had crumbled. The inheritance that Ryan had long believed was his by right had slipped through his fingers. Now, there was nothing left to do but rebuild, or, in their case, try to. Ryan and Megan had started selling off their possessions almost immediately, trying to recoup what they had lost. The houses, the cars, the high-end investments that had once symbolized their status, all of it was slowly disappearing. Maggie had heard murmurs through Victor, who had connections in the social circles they once inhabited, that Ryan was struggling to find footing. Ryan's calls had ceased altogether, his ego bruised beyond repair. Every time Maggie thought about the man he had become, how he had taken everything for granted, how he had dismissed her as weak, it only strengthened her resolve. This was the price of underestimating her. The family was unraveling, and it was all Ryan's doing. Megan, for her part, had retreated into silence. She no longer made the rounds at the social gatherings, the charity events, or the networking functions that had once kept her so busy. She kept her distance, pretending to be busy with personal matters. But Maggie saw the cracks. The polished exterior she had once so carefully curated was falling apart. She was no longer the woman who had silently maneuvered her way through life. Now she was just another face in the crowd, unnoticed and unimportant. Maggie didn't take joy in it. She didn't gloat. The chaos they were facing was of their own making, but it didn't bring her happiness to see them suffer. The aftermath had a certain peace to it, though. A quiet, still satisfaction that came from knowing the right decision had been made. She didn't rush to intervene, didn't make any phone calls to offer advice or comfort. She was done playing that part. Ryan had pushed her to the edge for the last time, and now there was nothing left to say. Instead, Maggie enjoyed the silence. The noise had stopped. The constant demands, the manipulations, the subtle undermining that had been a part of her life for so long. For the first time in years, she could breathe without the weight of expectations pulling her down. She was finally at peace. Lucas, however, had been a constant presence. He was the one person who had never underestimated her. The one who had quietly observed from the sidelines, always understanding, never asking for anything more than what she could offer. He came by often, sometimes to discuss business, sometimes just to sit with her in comfortable silence. But Maggie always knew that Lucas understood. He understood the depth of her strength, and he understood what had led her to this point. One afternoon, as the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the room, Lucas visited again. He sat across from her, his posture relaxed, but there was something different in his eyes today. It was the quiet respect he had always held for her, but now it had deepened into something more. "Grandma?" he said, breaking the silence, his voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you." Maggie looked up at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She could see the sincerity in his gaze. He wasn't just paying her lip service. He understood what she had done, why she had done it. And that was enough for her. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes momentarily drifting to the stack of papers on her desk. The papers that represented the decisions she had made, the choices that had led her here. "Thank you, Lucas," she said softly, her voice steady but warm. "But it wasn't about the money. It was about who I am." Lucas didn't reply immediately. He didn't need to. There was an understanding between them, an unspoken bond that had always been there. Maggie had always been the backbone of their success, the one who had held everything together. But now, she was also the one who had decided it was time to let go. She didn't need to prove anything to Ryan, to Megan, or to anyone else. Her legacy, her empire, her decisions, they were hers. And Lucas would carry it forward with the same respect and care that she had always shown. Ryan, for all his bluster, would never contact her again. He had learned the hard way that there was no way back. No apology would fix the damage he had done. No amount of anger or frustration could change the fact that Maggie had made the decision, and the decision was final. Maggie stood up from her chair, crossing the room to stand by the window. The city outside was bustling, but inside her office, there was only peace. "Everything that's happened," she said, her voice quiet, "was necessary. And now, it's over." Lucas joined her by the window, his presence solid and reassuring. Together, they stood in silence, watching the world move on without them, while they remained rooted in the knowledge that finally they had the peace they deserved. And for Ryan, the storm would continue to rage. But Maggie? She was done with the chaos. She had already won. The weeks that followed the court ruling were peaceful in a way Maggie hadn't experienced in years. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders for so long, the constant expectation, the subtle undermining, had been lifted. She'd made her decisions, and now the world, for once, felt calm. Her office, once a battleground of endless meetings and urgent calls, had transformed into a sanctuary. The quiet hum of the city outside her windows, the soft rustle of papers as she reviewed her investments, it all felt almost serene. The phone calls she once dreaded now had a soothing rhythm. Her investments were flourishing, growing as they always had. But now, with the added satisfaction of knowing they were entirely under her control. Every decision she had made, every move she had carefully planned, was paying off. There were no more negotiations, no more manipulations, just the quiet strength of watching her empire rise without the interference of those who had never truly appreciated it. The financial statements came in steadily, the numbers climbing, the growth undeniable. Maggie took it all in with a calm satisfaction. She wasn't interested in the spotlight anymore. She wasn't concerned with what Ryan or Megan might think. For the first time in years, she could simply breathe. Breathe without the constant hum of anxiety in the back of her mind. Meanwhile, Ryan and Megan were slowly fading from the social scene. The name Larkin, that once carried weight, that once opened doors and sealed deals, was now being whispered in less flattering contexts. Once the darlings of every charity event, every gala, they now found themselves excluded. People no longer flocked to their side. Megan had tried to make a few reappearances at high-profile events, but each time the reception grew colder. Her carefully crafted social circle began to unravel, and without Maggie's backing, without the wealth and influence that had once buoyed them, they were nothing more than another fading name in the gossip columns. Ryan, for all his bluster, could only watch as his world shrank. The calls to potential business partners dwindled. The meetings that once had followed his every beck and call were now sparse. Maggie had known this would happen. They had always been shallow, reliant on a legacy they had never earned. And now, it was gone. The door had closed, and there was no way for them to open it again. Maggie, for her part, didn't gloat. She didn't revel in their downfall. There was no joy in seeing the family she had once nurtured fall apart. But she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing everything come full circle. She had taken control of her life, her legacy. She had fought the battle with quiet grace. And now, the world was moving on without the chaos that Ryan and Megan had brought. One afternoon, Lucas came to visit her in the office. It had become a routine over the past few months. He would stop by, sit in her office with her, sometimes to discuss business, other times just to talk. But today was different. He had a particular weight in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made Maggie pause as he entered. "Grandma," he said, his voice clear, steady. "The company's annual meeting is coming up. We need a speaker. I want to do it. I want to speak to everyone on behalf of the family. I think it's time they hear from me." Maggie looked at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. She had always known Lucas was capable of leading. He had been her silent ally for years, watching, learning, never rushing to claim what he had not yet earned. He had always understood what true leadership was, not the showmanship of his father, not the superficial charm Megan had relied on, but the quiet strength of someone who led by example, who commanded respect through integrity. "Go ahead, Lucas," Maggie said, her voice calm but full of warmth. "You've earned it. Speak from the heart." The day of the annual meeting, Lucas stood before the board of directors, the shareholders, and employees. He had never been one to speak at length, to draw attention to himself, but today he did so with a quiet grace that had all eyes fixed on him. The room, once dominated by the Larkins' name, now felt different. It was no longer about who had the loudest voice or the most money. It was about leadership. It was about respect. "I stand before you," Lucas began, his voice steady and clear. "Not as someone who inherited this legacy, but as someone who understands the weight of it. My grandmother has taught me more about leadership than anyone else ever could. She taught me that true power isn't about wealth or influence. It's about the strength to make decisions, to stand by them, no matter the consequences." Maggie sat in the back of the room, her eyes softening as she listened. She knew that the company's future was secure in his hands. He was her legacy, not Ryan. "I'm proud of what this company has become, and I'm proud to lead it into the next chapter," Lucas continued. "I owe that to my grandmother. Her example, her quiet strength, has shaped me more than anything else, and I'll make sure the company continues to stand on that foundation." Maggie watched as the room nodded in approval, as people leaned forward to hear more, to understand what Lucas was building. She smiled softly to herself. There was no need for applause. She had already set things right. Later that evening, after the meeting had ended, Maggie sat alone in her office, the city lights casting a soft glow across her desk. She glanced at the framed picture of David on her desk, the man who had built this legacy alongside her, and felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. But she knew one thing for certain. Everything she had done, every decision she had made, had been worth it. And for Ryan? For Megan? They were ghosts now, fading from the world they had once ruled. But Maggie? She had claimed the peace she had long been denied. She had set things right. The days grew longer, the air warmer, and Maggie's world settled into a rhythm she hadn't known in years. Her empire, once a tangled web of obligations and compromises, now thrived under Lucas's leadership. It was steady, growing, almost effortlessly. Every day brought new successes, new milestones. The company was stronger than ever, and as the months passed, Maggie watched from the shadows, knowing that the legacy she had built would be secure in Lucas's hands. The news articles, the industry reports. Everyone was taking note. Lucas was a breath of fresh air. His steady hand, his calm demeanor, his unwavering sense of integrity were everything the company needed. No longer overshadowed by Ryan's ego or Megan's hollow ambitions, the business flourished in ways Maggie had always known it could. Ryan and Megan? They were barely a whisper in the social scene now. The invitations stopped coming. The phone calls, the offers. They evaporated as quickly as their fortunes had. People began to forget who they were. The Larkins, once the power couple, once the names that everyone wanted to be associated with, faded into the background. Maggie didn't need to lift a finger to ensure their decline. Their decline had come naturally, an inevitability brought on by their own hubris. Maggie thought back to the years she had spent building it all, the late nights, the sleepless weeks, the endless work. She remembered David's quiet support, his calming presence, and the way they had once shared the dream of building something that would last long beyond them. She could still hear his voice in her head when things got tough, still feel the weight of his absence beside her. But she had done it. She had made it hers. Her thoughts turned to the house, the home she had once shared with Ryan. It had felt like a prison then. Every room echoed with the past, with memories of arguments, of resentment simmering beneath the surface. It was in that house that Ryan had slammed the door on her, quite literally and metaphorically. The final moment when she realized she could no longer tolerate his disrespect. That house had held too many ghosts, too many expectations that had only weighed her down. But now, it was hers again. Maggie had made sure of that. It had taken time, but it had been worth it. The house, her home, was no longer a place of regret. It had become a symbol of her independence, of the decision she had made to reclaim what was hers. She had renovated it, restored the old beauty that had been lost in the chaos of her marriage. Now it stood as a reflection of who she had become, strong, unyielding, and finally at peace. She stood by the window, the soft light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the polished floor. She had spent years being second-guessed, underappreciated, and disregarded by those she had trusted. But she had risen above it all. The decisions she had made, the battles she had fought, they had been for this moment, for this quiet strength that no one could take away from her. Her eyes lingered on the skyline outside, watching as the world moved at its usual pace. People rushed to and fro, their lives intertwined with the noise of ambition and uncertainty. But Maggie had learned to tune it all out. She had learned that the true power lay not in the noise, but in the silence that followed. In the moments when the world was still, and she was simply herself. She could feel the weight of the journey, the years of hardship, of sacrifice, of keeping her head down and pushing forward when the world seemed to stand against her. But now, as she stood in the midst of everything she had built, she understood that it had all been worth it. Every decision, every moment of doubt, every hard choice she had made had led her to this. Her legacy was not defined by wealth or by power. It was defined by her ability to stand firm, to remain unbroken in the face of adversity. And that legacy would last far beyond her. It was the foundation Lucas would build on, the future she had secured for him and for the company. Maggie smiled to herself, a small, satisfied curve of her lips. She had done it. She had won. Ryan would never understand what it meant to truly earn respect. Megan would never grasp the quiet strength it took to build something that lasted. They were already forgotten by most. And Maggie? She was standing tall, unshaken, knowing that she had fought the right battle. She had set things right, not through vengeance but through quiet, unwavering determination. The peace she had claimed was hers to keep, and it was the only thing that truly mattered. The years passed in a slow, steady march, and Maggie's life, once filled with conflict and chaos, settled into a rhythm of peaceful authority. She watched the world move on without her, without Ryan, without Megan, and yet she stood unwavering. The doors they had once used to enter her world remained closed. Neither Ryan nor Megan ever dared to cross that threshold again. Their attempts to remain relevant, to re-enter the circles they had once dominated, fell on deaf ears. Ryan, in particular, tried in vain to leverage whatever scraps of influence he could still grasp. But it was all in vain. The reputation he had once so carefully built had eroded. Without Maggie's backing, without her name attached to his, he was nothing more than a forgotten relic. A ghost in a world that had moved on. Megan faded into the background as well. The charity events, the high society gatherings that she had once maneuvered through with practiced ease, had slowly stopped inviting her. Without her connection to the family legacy, she was just another face in a crowd of people trying to maintain the illusion of success. She withdrew into the shadows, her voice no longer heard, her influence no longer felt. Maggie could feel the absence of their presence, but she never sought it. In contrast, the legacy Maggie had built was thriving. Lucas, steady and determined, had become the face of the business. He didn't seek the spotlight, didn't crave the attention his father had, but the respect he commanded was undeniable. The company had never been in better hands. It grew, and it flourished under Lucas's leadership, and with each new achievement, Maggie felt the weight of her decisions settle into place, knowing that the future she had fought for was secure. Maggie's influence, once hidden behind the shadows of Ryan's arrogance, now radiated in the quiet strength she had always possessed. Her name, no longer associated with the chaotic Larkin household, became synonymous with stability. She wasn't just the matriarch anymore. She was the true patriarch of the family, the foundation of everything that had been built and everything that would continue to grow. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the city, Maggie sat at her desk, reviewing a new set of reports. Her thoughts were calm, her mind clear. She had made the right choice. Her empire was thriving, Lucas was leading, and she had earned the peace she had longed for. It was then that the phone rang. The name that flashed on the screen was one she hadn't expected: Ryan. Her hand paused above the receiver, her mind flashing back to that moment when the car door slammed on her arm, when she had made the decision that would forever alter the course of their relationship. She could already hear the tension in his voice, the familiar arrogance wrapped in desperation. But Maggie didn't feel a need to answer. She let the phone ring. The message came shortly after. Ryan's voice, cracking slightly, carrying a tone of something Maggie hadn't heard from him in years: sincerity. "Maggie," he said, the words heavy with what she could only guess was regret. "I've had time to think about everything. I was wrong. I've lost everything, and it's my fault. I never understood, never respected you the way I should have. I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that. You were right, and I was blind. I've made my bed." Maggie didn't rush to pick up the phone. She sat there for a long moment staring at the screen. She had long since stopped needing his apology. She had long since stopped needing anything from Ryan, or from Megan, or anyone who had never truly seen her. They had made their choices, and now she had made hers. The doors had been closed for a reason. After a moment, she picked up the phone and typed a simple response. "It's too late." She placed the phone back down on the desk, her hand steady, her mind at peace. There would be no more apologies, no more explanations. The time for all of that had passed. Ryan had tried to reach out, but the distance between them was no longer something that could be bridged by a few words. The door was closed, permanently. Maggie leaned back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile curving her lips. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She had simply made the decisions she needed to make, the ones that had been waiting to be made for years. And now, the consequences, both his and hers, had played out. Ryan had learned the hard way that respect wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn. As Maggie looked out over the city, the skyline shimmering in the twilight, she felt the quiet power of everything she had built. She had won, not through brute force, not through manipulation, but through strength, resolve, and the decision to stand firm when everything around her had tried to pull her down. At the airport curb, my son slammed the car door on me. He found out who owned the door.